In 1960, Miriam Makeba was becoming famous. Her voice was traveling across the world. People who had never seen South Africa were listening to her sing. They called her beautiful. They called her talented. And soon, they would call her Mama Africa. But that same year, Miriam Makeba tried to go home. Her mother had died. She wanted to return to South Africa. To Johannesburg. To the people she knew. To the country where her voice had first been heard. But at the border, she discovered something she could hardly believe. She was not allowed to enter. Her government had cancelled her passport. The country she was born in, the country she had carried in her songs, had closed its doors to her. Why? Because Miriam Makeba had begun telling the world about apartheid. She had seen what racial segregation did to ordinary black South Africans. And now that she had the world's attention, she refused to remain silent. The government could take away her passport. It could keep her from going home. But it could not take away her voice. So Miriam Makeba did something extraordinary. She turned the stages of the world into a place from which she could speak about her homeland. She sang African songs. She told African stories. And she spoke about a country where millions of people were being denied the rights that others took for granted. Her voice traveled from Johannesburg to New York, to London, to the United Nations, and eventually back home. But the journey would take decades. This is not simply the story of a singer. It is the story of a woman who lost her country and spent her life making sure the world did not forget it. This is the story of Miriam Makeba, the voice they could not silence. Chapter 1. A girl from Johannesburg. Before the world knew her as Mama Africa, she was simply a young girl growing up in South Africa. Her name was Miriam Makeba. She was born in Johannesburg in 1932, into a country where the color of your skin could decide where you lived, where you worked, and what opportunities were open to you. But Miriam was too young to understand the full meaning of the system around her. She knew only the world she could see. She knew her family. She knew church. And she knew music. Music was everywhere. It was in the songs people sang at home. It was in church gatherings. It was in the streets and communities of Johannesburg. And Miriam had a voice that people noticed. She could sing. But life was not easy. Her family struggled financially. As a young woman, Miriam experienced the harsh realities of being black in South Africa. She saw how laws and poverty could limit people's choices. She watched a society where black people were expected to live under rules they had no power to make. Later, this system would become known throughout the world as apartheid. But even before apartheid became official government policy in 1948, racial segregation and discrimination were already deeply rooted in South African society. Miriam's own life would soon bring her face to face with its consequences. Yet music gave her something the system could not control. A voice. She began singing in church. Then she started performing with local groups. Her talent slowly carried her beyond her immediate surroundings. In the growing music scene of Johannesburg, she discovered a new world. There were singers, dancers, bands, and audiences hungry for music that sounded like their own lives. Miriam joined the Skylarks, an all-female vocal group. Later, she performed with the Manhattan Brothers. She was no longer simply a girl who sang at home. She was becoming a professional performer. Audiences began to notice her. But Miriam was also discovering something else. A singer could entertain people. But a singer could also tell their story. And outside the music halls, South Africa was changing. In 1948, the National Party came to power and began formally building the system of apartheid. Apartheid is a system of racial separation in which laws give different rights and opportunities to different racial groups. For black South Africans, the restrictions became increasingly severe. Where they could live, where they could work, where they could travel, who they could marry, even the places they could enter. Miriam was growing into a woman while her country was becoming more divided. She could not know it yet. But the music that was taking her away from the streets of Johannesburg would eventually take her into the heart of the struggle against apartheid. And one day, the whole world would hear her sing. Chapter 2. Finding her voice. Miriam Makeba was no longer just the young girl who sang in church. She was becoming a performer. Johannesburg's music scene was alive. Jazz clubs were filled with musicians. Groups performed in crowded halls. People came to dance, listen, and forget their troubles for a few hours. Miriam found her place among them. She joined the Skylarks, an all-female vocal group that became popular in South Africa. Later, she performed with the Manhattan Brothers. Her voice stood out. It was clear, warm, and unmistakably African. She could sing modern popular music while still carrying the sound of her homeland. For Miriam, music was becoming more than a way to earn a living. It was becoming an identity. Then came an opportunity that would change her life. A filmmaker named Lionel Rogerson was making a film about life under apartheid. The film was called Come Back, Africa. Miriam appeared in it. The film showed the harsh reality faced by Black South Africans. It was not a glamorous picture of the country. It showed poverty, racial discrimination, fear, and the daily struggle of people living under a system designed to keep them separated and unequal. Miriam's appearance in the film was brief, but her presence made an impression. The film was shown internationally, including at the Venice Film Festival in 1959. Suddenly, people outside South Africa were hearing Miriam Makeba. Not just as a singer, but as a South African woman whose life was connected to the reality shown on screen. Her voice had crossed the border. And then another opportunity appeared. She was invited to travel to the United States. For a young woman who had grown up in Johannesburg, the world suddenly seemed enormous. America was different. The audiences were different. The stages were bigger. And the possibilities seemed endless. Miriam began building an international career. She met musicians and performers who admired her talent. She appeared on television. She performed for audiences who had never heard African music quite like this before. But something followed her wherever she went. South Africa. People wanted to know about the country she came from. They wanted to understand apartheid. And Miriam could not pretend she did not know what was happening. She had lived it. She had seen it. She had experienced the restrictions that came with being black in South Africa. So when people asked her about home, she began to tell them the truth. Her fame was growing. Her audience was growing. And with every new audience, her voice became more powerful. But Miriam was about to discover that having a voice in the international spotlight came with a price. Because the more she spoke about apartheid, the harder it would become for her to return home. Chapter 3. The world begins to listen. America opened a door that Miriam Makeba had never imagined. She was performing before new audiences. Her name was appearing in newspapers. Her voice was reaching people who knew almost nothing about South Africa. But success brought questions. People wanted to know about the woman behind the voice. Where was she from? What was life like in South Africa? And what was this system called apartheid? Miriam answered them. She did not need to invent stories. She had lived under the system herself. She knew what it meant to be black in South Africa. She knew that the laws were not simply words written on paper. They shaped where people could live, where they could work, where they could travel, and how they were treated. The more Miriam spoke, the more important her voice became. She was no longer simply an entertainer from South Africa. She was becoming a witness. Then her music reached an even larger audience. One of her most famous songs was Poto Poto. The song became an international hit. People danced to it. Radio stations played it. Audiences around the world learned her name. But Miriam wanted them to hear more than a catchy song. She wanted them to hear Africa. She sang in African languages. She brought traditional sounds onto international stages. She showed audiences that African music did not need to imitate Europe or America to be beautiful. Her growing fame eventually earned her the name Mama Africa. It was a powerful title. She had become one of the world's most recognizable African performers. But fame also created a responsibility. Miriam now had something many ordinary South Africans did not have: an international platform. When she spoke, people listened. And she decided to use that platform. She began speaking more openly against apartheid. She attended political gatherings. She supported the struggle against racial oppression. She spoke about the suffering of black South Africans before audiences that had the power to influence governments. The South African government noticed. Miriam's music was no longer the only thing they were watching. Her words mattered too. Then, in 1960, something happened that changed her life forever. Miriam's mother died. She wanted to go home for the funeral. After years of traveling and performing abroad, she wanted to return to South Africa. To Johannesburg. To her family. To the place where her journey had begun. But when she tried to return, she discovered that she was no longer welcome. Her passport had been revoked. The country she had spent years representing around the world had closed its doors to her. Miriam Makeba had become famous. But she had also become an exile. And from that moment forward, her fight against apartheid would become deeply personal. Chapter 4. When home was taken away. Miriam Makeba had spent years carrying South Africa with her. She carried it in her songs, in her language, in the stories she told on stages around the world. But now, when she needed South Africa most, she could not enter. In 1960, Miriam's mother died. She wanted to return home for the funeral. But when she tried to travel back to South Africa, she discovered that her passport had been revoked. She was not allowed to return. Imagine that moment. You are famous around the world. People know your voice. You can perform in some of the greatest cities on earth. But you cannot walk into your own country. For Miriam, exile was no longer a political idea. It was personal. Her homeland had become a place she could only remember from a distance. And then came one of the darkest moments in South African history. On March 21, 1960, police opened fire on protesters in the township of Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. Hundreds more were wounded. The protesters had gathered against the country's past laws, which controlled where black South Africans could live and travel. News of the massacre shocked the world. For Miriam, it confirmed what she had already been telling international audiences. Apartheid was not simply a political system. It was a system that could destroy lives. Now she had an even larger reason to speak. She traveled from country to country. She performed. She gave interviews. She spoke about South Africa. She told audiences about people who had no international platform of their own. Her fame became a weapon against silence. But there was a cost. Some people accused her of bringing politics into music. Others believed she should simply sing and leave politics to politicians. Miriam disagreed. How could she sing about Africa and remain silent about what was happening to Africans? Her music and her activism became impossible to separate. She appeared before the United Nations and spoke about apartheid. World leaders heard her. Millions of ordinary people heard her. The singer who had once dreamed of becoming successful had become something else. A witness for a country that could no longer hear her in person. But exile was not easy. She missed home. She missed family. She missed the streets where her story had begun. International fame could not replace belonging. She could stand before thousands of people and still feel alone. Yet every time she stepped onto a stage, she made the same choice. She would speak. She would sing. She would remember. And she would not allow the world to forget South Africa. The government had taken away her passport. But it had given her something else without intending to. A reason to make the whole world listen. Chapter 5. Speaking to the world. Miriam Makeba could no longer return to South Africa. So she took South Africa with her. Everywhere she traveled, people wanted to hear her sing. But increasingly, they also wanted to hear her speak. What was apartheid really like? What happened to black South Africans? Why could she not go home? Miriam answered them. She spoke about a system that separated people by race and denied the black majority basic political rights. She spoke about families being forced from their homes. About laws that controlled where people could live and work. About a country where being born black could determine the opportunities available to you. Her voice reached places that political activists could not easily reach. And then came one of the most important moments of her public life. In 1963, Miriam Makeba addressed the United Nations. She spoke about apartheid before an international audience. She was no longer simply a singer performing on a stage. She was a witness speaking for people whose voices were being suppressed. But the world of politics was complicated. Makeba supported African liberation movements and developed relationships with political figures across Africa and beyond. Her political choices sometimes brought controversy. Some governments and audiences celebrated her. Others became uncomfortable with her activism. Her career suffered because she refused to separate her art from her beliefs. There were times when venues became difficult to find. There were times when people who had once welcomed her were no longer interested. But she continued. Then came another important chapter in her life. She married Stokely Carmichael, a prominent American civil rights activist, in 1968. The marriage attracted intense attention in the United States. Carmichael was a controversial figure to many Americans, particularly because of his advocacy of black power. Makeba's political image became even stronger. The pressure increased. Soon, the United States was no longer as comfortable with her as it had once been. Her career there suffered. But Miriam did not disappear. She moved through different countries. She continued performing. She continued speaking. And she continued representing Africa on the international stage. Her life had become a strange contradiction. She was celebrated around the world. Yet she remained separated from home. She had fame. But fame could not give her back her passport. She had international audiences. But she could not simply walk through the streets of Johannesburg whenever she wanted. Still, she refused to allow Exile to define her only as a victim. She turned it into a platform. She became an international symbol of African dignity. She showed audiences that African music could stand proudly on the world's biggest stages. And she reminded people that the struggle against apartheid was not only about politics. It was about human beings. Families. Dreams. Dignity. Freedom. For decades, Miriam Makeba kept telling that story. Then, slowly, the country she had been forced to leave began to change. And one day, after years of waiting, the possibility of going home finally appeared. Chapter 6. Mama Africa comes home. For almost 3 decades, Miriam Makeba lived with a pain that fame could not erase. She could travel across the world. She could perform before thousands of people. She could walk onto the biggest stages. But there was one journey she could not make. Home. Then, in 1990, something changed. Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years behind bars. The system that had kept South Africa divided was beginning to weaken. The country was moving toward democracy. And after decades of exile, Miriam Makeba could finally return. Imagine what that moment must have meant. The young woman who had left South Africa as a rising singer was now returning as an internationally known artist. She had spent years telling the world about her homeland. Now she could finally stand on its soil again. She returned to a country that had changed dramatically. The apartheid system was being dismantled. Black South Africans were gaining political rights. And in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election based on universal adult suffrage. Nelson Mandela became president. For Miriam, the victory was deeply personal. She had spent decades singing for a freedom she could now see. But she did not stop. She continued performing. She continued speaking about Africa. She supported humanitarian causes. She advocated for women and children. And she remained committed to using her fame for people who had little power of their own. By then, the world had given her a name. Mama Africa. But perhaps the name meant more than fame. It reflected the way she had carried African culture across borders. She had introduced millions of people to African music and languages. She had shown that an African woman could stand on an international stage without hiding where she came from. And she had shown that an artist could challenge injustice without surrendering her identity. Then, in 2008, Miriam Makeba traveled to Italy to perform at a concert supporting the writer and journalist Roberto Saviano, who had faced threats from organized crime because of his work. She performed despite health problems. After the concert, she became ill. She died on November 10, 2008. She was 76 years old. The woman who had spent decades unable to return home was gone. But her voice remained. It remained in the songs she recorded, in the musicians she influenced, in the history of the anti-apartheid struggle, and in the memory of millions who heard her sing. Miriam Makeba began as a girl from Johannesburg. She became a singer, then an exile, then an activist, and finally, a symbol. She lost her country for speaking about injustice. But she never stopped carrying it with her. And when the doors finally opened, she came home. Thank you for joining us on the African Archive as we explore the extraordinary life of Miriam Makeba. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us for more stories of the people whose courage, culture, and determination helped shape Africa. Because history is not only found in the speeches of presidents. Sometimes it is carried in the voice of a woman who refuses to be silent. Miriam Makeba's voice did not belong to a government. It belonged to the people. And long after she stopped singing, the world continued to listen.